The winds howled across the wide, open plains as dusk painted the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple. 10-year-old Clara sat motionless in her wheelchair, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the wild horses roamed free. Her mother, Rachel, called softly from the nearby camper, but Clara didn't respond. She rarely did. Then, out of the swirling dust, something caught her eye. A powerful Mustang, its black mane flowing like liquid shadow, trotted toward her. Rachel froze in the doorway, panic flickering in her eyes. But Clara, for the first time in weeks, smiled. The wind danced across the open plains, carrying the scent of wild grass and the distant sound of hoofbeats. Clara sat motionless in her wheelchair, her small hands gripping the armrest as her eyes fixed on the horizon. She wasn't like most children. At 10 years old, she rarely spoke, rarely smiled. Her mother, Rachel, stood a few feet away, watching her daughter with a mix of worry and exhaustion etched into her face. This trip to Mustang Valley had been her late husband's dream, a chance to show Clara the beauty of the wild horses he'd always admired. But now, it felt like a desperate attempt to reconnect with a part of him they had lost. The valley stretched endlessly before them, a canvas of rolling hills and golden sunlight. Clara's eyes flickered with something Rachel hadn't seen in months: interest. She raised her hand, pointing toward a dark figure in the distance. Rachel squinted, shielding her eyes from the glare, and saw it too. A lone Mustang stood atop a hill, its black mane rippling like silk in the breeze. The horse was majestic, its powerful frame silhouetted against the amber sky. It watched them unmoving, as if deciding whether to approach. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. Wild horses weren't known for their friendliness, and this one seemed different, larger, more intense. "Stay still, Clara," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't want to scare the animal or risk any harm coming to her daughter. But Clara didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her gaze locked on the Mustang as though they were sharing a silent conversation. The horse took a cautious step forward, then another, its hooves kicking up small clouds of dust. Rachel held her breath, unsure of what to do. Every instinct told her to pull Clara back, but she hesitated. Something about the way the horse moved, slow and deliberate, calmed her fear. It wasn't aggressive. If anything, it seemed curious. Clara's hand lifted slightly, her fingers trembling as they extended toward the approaching Mustang. Rachel's heart raced, torn between awe and dread. The horse stopped a few feet away, its dark eyes studying Clara with an intensity that sent shivers down Rachel's spine. It was as if the animal could see something others couldn't, something hidden deep within the quiet girl who rarely let anyone in. The Mustang lowered its head, its nose inches from Clara's outstretched hand. Rachel wanted to shout, to break the moment and pull her daughter to safety, but she couldn't move. The connection between them was palpable, almost otherworldly. Clara's lips parted slightly, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Rachel saw her daughter smile. The horse's warm breath brushed against Clara's fingers as it nudged her hand gently. Clara let out a soft giggle, a sound so unexpected that it brought tears to Rachel's eyes. She covered her mouth, afraid to disturb the fragile moment. The Mustang seemed to sense Clara's joy, its ears flicking forward as it stood still, allowing her to stroke its velvety nose. For a few precious minutes, the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind softened, the distant rustle of leaves fading into silence. It was just Clara and the Mustang, two beings who had found something in each other that no one else could provide. Rachel didn't know how or why, but she knew this was significant. Her daughter, who had been locked away in her own mind since her father's death, was reaching out, truly reaching out, for the first time. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the moment ended. The Mustang whinnied softly, its ears twitching toward a distant sound Rachel couldn't hear. It stepped back, its powerful muscles rippling as it prepared to leave. Clara's hand fell to her lap, her smile fading into a look of longing. "No!" she whispered, her voice barely audible. It was the first word Rachel had heard her speak in months. The horse turned and galloped away, its dark form disappearing into the golden haze of the setting sun. Rachel stood frozen, her mind racing to process what she had just witnessed. Clara's hand lingered in the air, reaching for something that was no longer there. But her eyes, once dull and lifeless, now sparkled with a light Rachel hadn't seen since her husband's passing. That night, Clara couldn't stop pointing toward the horizon. She refused to eat, her focus entirely on the spot where the Mustang had vanished. Rachel sat beside her, holding her daughter's hand as tears streamed down her face. For the first time in a long while, those tears weren't just for the loss of her husband. They were for Clara, her beautiful, silent daughter, who had finally shown a spark of life. As the stars blanketed the sky, Clara whispered a single word, Shadow. It was the name she had chosen for the Mustang. And Rachel knew it was only the beginning. Something extraordinary had happened in those fleeting moments, something that had the power to change everything. The next morning, Clara was restless. Her usual stillness was replaced by an unmistakable energy that left Rachel both anxious and hopeful. Clara tugged at her mother's hand, her gaze fixed on the spot where the Mustang had disappeared the evening before. Rachel hesitated, unsure whether returning there would help or hurt, but Clara's insistence was unyielding. The way she pointed toward the horizon, her eyes alight with determination, was unlike anything Rachel had seen in her daughter before. Finally, she gave in, packing water and snacks before wheeling Clara back out into the plains. The landscape was as vast and quiet as ever, with only the gentle whisper of the wind and the occasional cry of a bird breaking the stillness. Rachel settled them under the shade of a large oak tree near the same clearing. Clara's eyes scanned the horizon, her body leaning forward slightly in her wheelchair as though willing the Mustang to appear. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and Rachel began to wonder if they had made a mistake coming back. Clara, however, seemed unfazed by the passage of time. She stared intently at the horizon, her gaze unwavering. Rachel marveled at her daughter's patience, which seemed far beyond what any child her age would normally have. Just as Rachel was about to suggest they return to the camper, Clara sat upright, her hand shooting out to point toward the distant hills. Rachel squinted, her heart skipping a beat as she caught sight of a familiar black shape moving against the golden grasses. Shadow was back. The Mustang emerged from the hills, his powerful frame moving with a grace that made him seem almost unreal. But this time he wasn't alone. Following close behind him was a small herd of wild horses, their coats a mix of chestnut, white, and gray. They moved cautiously, their movements fluid yet hesitant, as though they were unsure of the humans in their midst. Shadow, however, seemed unbothered, his focus fixed entirely on Clara. Rachel felt her chest tighten as the Mustang approached, his steps deliberate and slow. Behind him, the rest of the herd hung back, their ears flicking nervously. Shadow stopped just a few feet away from Clara's wheelchair, lowering his head as he had the day before. Clara reached out without hesitation, her small hand brushing against his muzzle. Her laughter rang out, light and pure, and for a moment, Rachel forgot her fears. Shadow stood still, allowing Clara to stroke his nose and mane, his dark eyes filled with an intelligence that was almost unnerving. The other horses watched from a distance, their bodies tense and ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Clara seemed to notice them too, her attention drifting toward the herd. She pointed, her face lighting up with curiosity. Shadow glanced back at his companions, letting out a soft whinny as if to reassure them. Slowly, cautiously, one of the younger horses stepped forward, its movements hesitant and jerky. Rachel held her breath, her grip tightening on the handles of Clara's wheelchair. The young horse stopped a few feet away, its wide eyes darting between Clara and Shadow. Clara extended her hand again, but this time the horse didn't approach. Instead, it nickered softly, its ears swiveling forward and back. Shadow nudged the younger horse gently, his body language calm and encouraging. Finally, the young horse stepped closer, its nose brushing against Clara's outstretched fingers. Clara giggled, the sound so bright that Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. The moment was interrupted by a low rumble in the distance. Rachel turned her head toward the horizon, her stomach sinking as she saw dark storm clouds gathering. The sky had grown heavier, the sunlight dimming under the weight of the approaching storm. She placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, her voice soft but firm. "We need to go, sweetheart. It's going to rain soon." Clara frowned, shaking her head and pointing toward Shadow. She didn't want to leave. That much was clear. Rachel bit her lip, torn between wanting to protect her daughter from the storm and not wanting to take away the rare connection Clara had found. But the clouds were growing darker, and the first drops of rain had already begun to fall. Before Rachel could say anything else, a sudden crack of lightning split the sky. The sound was deafening, and the herd scattered in an instant, their hooves pounding the earth as they bolted for safety. Shadow lingered for only a moment, his body tense and his ears pinned back. He looked at Clara, then at Rachel, as though trying to make a decision. Another bolt of lightning flashed, and Shadow turned, galloping after his herd. Clara cried out, her voice rising in a way that made Rachel's heart ache. She reached toward the horizon, tears streaming down her cheeks as she called Shadow's name. Rachel knelt beside her, wrapping her arms around her daughter as the rain began to pour in earnest. The storm raged around them, the wind howling and the thunder rolling like distant drums. Clara sobbed into Rachel's shoulder, her small frame trembling. When they finally returned to the camper, soaked and shivering, Rachel dried Clara off and wrapped her in a blanket. Clara didn't speak for the rest of the evening, her eyes fixed on the rain-slicked window. Rachel sat beside her, stroking her hair and whispering soft reassurances. Deep down, though, she knew that something had shifted in her daughter. The bond with Shadow wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was the beginning of something profound. What that was, Rachel didn't yet know. But she was determined to see it through. No matter what, the storm raged through the night, the camper trembling with every gust of wind. Clara sat silently by the window, her small fingers tracing the rivulets of rain that slid down the glass. Rachel stayed close, watching her daughter with a mixture of concern and helplessness. Clara had always been difficult to read, but tonight there was something different, a weight in her silence that Rachel couldn't ignore. She crouched beside her, gently brushing damp strands of hair from her daughter's face. Clara's lips moved, barely forming the words she had clung to since the moment she met the Mustang. "Shadow?" Rachel sighed, her own exhaustion gnawing at her, but Clara's determination was unwavering. She stayed by the window long after Rachel had tucked her into bed, her eyes searching the darkness as if willing Shadow to appear. The storm didn't let up until the early hours of the morning, and when Rachel finally drifted off to sleep, she dreamed of hoofbeats echoing across endless fields. The next day dawned cold and clear, the storm having swept away the summer heat. Clara was up before the sun, tugging at Rachel's arm with an urgency that left no room for hesitation. Rachel rubbed her tired eyes and threw on a jacket, already knowing what her daughter wanted. There was no questioning it. Clara needed to go back to the clearing. Rachel pushed Clara's wheelchair across the muddy ground, their path marked by puddles and fallen branches. The air was fresh, tinged with the faint scent of rain-soaked earth, but the silence felt uneasy. Birds called from the trees, their songs sharp and hurried, as if warning of something unseen. Clara's focus was sharp, her head turning this way and that as if searching for a sign. Rachel didn't want to say it out loud, but she wasn't sure Shadow would come back. Wild horses were unpredictable, and after last night's chaos, he and his herd could be miles away. They reached the clearing, and Rachel parked the wheelchair beneath the large oak tree where they had waited before. Clara leaned forward, her hands gripping the arms of the chair, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Minutes stretched into an hour, and Rachel began to feel the weight of the damp air pressing down on her shoulders. Still, Clara didn't waver. Then, just as Rachel was about to suggest heading back, a sound broke the stillness. A faint, distant whinny. Clara's head shot up, her body stiff with anticipation. Rachel turned toward the sound, her heart leaping as a familiar figure appeared on the ridge. Shadow stood there, his dark coat gleaming in the sunlight, his mane rippling in the breeze. But something was wrong. He wasn't moving with his usual grace. His body seemed tense, his steps hurried. Rachel's stomach tightened as she noticed his frantic behavior. He wasn't alone this time either. A smaller figure moved awkwardly behind him, barely able to keep up. As Shadow drew closer, Rachel realized what was happening. The smaller figure was a foal, its legs wobbly and its coat plastered with mud. The young horse stumbled, its breath coming in short, sharp bursts, and Shadow circled back to nudge it forward. Clara's eyes widened, her hands gripping the edges of her chair as she watched the scene unfold. Shadow stopped a few feet from them, his ears flicking nervously as he glanced between Rachel and the foal. He let out a sharp whinny, pawing at the ground with one hoof, and Rachel suddenly understood. He was asking for help. Rachel's pulse quickened. She had no idea how to handle a wild horse, let alone one in distress. But Shadow's desperation left no room for doubt. She approached slowly, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. Shadow didn't flinch, his attention locked on her as she crouched beside the struggling foal. The young horse was in bad shape, its legs scratched and trembling, its breathing labored. Rachel's heart ached as she gently brushed away some of the mud from its coat. Clara made a soft sound, drawing both Rachel's and Shadow's attention. Her arm was outstretched, her fingers pointing toward the camper in the distance. Rachel nodded, understanding her daughter's silent suggestion. They needed to get the foal to shelter. She looked up at Shadow, her voice steady but soft. "We'll help," she said, as if he could understand her. In her heart, she believed he could. With careful movements, Rachel fashioned a makeshift sling from her jacket, tying it securely around the foal to provide support. Shadow stayed close, his breath warm against Rachel's neck as he watched her work. Clara's encouragement came in soft murmurs, her usually quiet voice carrying a strength that Rachel hadn't heard before. Together, they moved slowly, Rachel carrying the foal while Shadow walked protectively beside them. When they reached the camper, Rachel set the foal down on a blanket, her hands trembling with exhaustion. Clara wheeled closer, her face filled with concern and fascination. Shadow nudged the foal gently, his dark eyes filled with something Rachel could only describe as gratitude. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing against Shadow's mane, and for the first time, Rachel felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about a wild horse and a sick foal. It was about connection. Between Clara and Shadow, between the wild and the human, between loss and healing. The foal's breathing steadied as the day wore on, and by evening, it was able to stand on shaky legs. Shadow stayed close, his protective presence unwavering. Rachel watched the scene unfold with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Clara, usually so quiet and withdrawn, was animated, her hands moving as she communicated with Shadow in a way Rachel couldn't fully comprehend. It was surreal, almost magical, and for the first time in months, Rachel allowed herself to believe that things might just get better. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting long shadows over the plains as Rachel stepped outside the camper to check on Shadow and the foal. The little one had managed to find its footing, though its legs still wobbled with every cautious step. Shadow remained close, his powerful frame a steady reassurance for the young horse. Clara sat nearby in her wheelchair, her small hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched the two horses. There was something serene about the moment, as if the chaos of the storm and the fear of the previous night had been washed away. Rachel crouched beside Clara, her voice soft as she asked, "How are you feeling, sweetheart?" Clara didn't respond with words, but her expression spoke volumes. There was a brightness in her eyes, a quiet joy that Rachel hadn't seen in what felt like years. Clara's gaze never wavered from Shadow and the foal, and when she reached out a hand toward them, Shadow responded immediately. He stepped closer, his dark eyes locking onto Clara's as he lowered his head toward her outstretched palm. The connection between Clara and Shadow was undeniable, and Rachel marveled at how natural it seemed. This wild, untamed horse, who should have been cautious or even wary of humans, instead trusted her daughter completely. And Clara, who rarely connected with the world around her, had found something extraordinary in Shadow. The foal, now steadier on its legs, nickered softly and took a hesitant step toward Clara as well. It was a small, tentative gesture, but it was enough to make Clara's face light up with a smile so genuine that it brought tears to Rachel's eyes. As the evening wore on, Rachel decided to light a small fire to keep the chill away. The flames crackled softly, their warm glow casting a comforting light across the clearing. Clara continued to watch Shadow and the foal, occasionally glancing toward Rachel as if to silently share her amazement. Rachel couldn't help but smile. She hadn't felt this hopeful in months, and she silently thanked the Mustang for bringing this change to their lives. Shadow seemed to sense that the area around the camper was safe. He grazed near the edge of the clearing, his sharp ears flicking occasionally toward the sound of distant rustling in the tall grass. The foal stayed close to him, occasionally lying down to rest, but always keeping one eye on Shadow. Clara, too, seemed at ease, her posture relaxed as she leaned back in her wheelchair. The tension that had gripped her small frame for so long was gone, replaced by an undeniable sense of calm. Rachel leaned back against the camper, her gaze drifting to the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. It had been so long since she'd taken a moment to simply breathe, to let herself feel something other than grief or worry. The loss of her husband had left a void in her life that seemed impossible to fill, and for a long time, she had feared that void would swallow Clara too. But now, watching her daughter interact with Shadow and the foal, Rachel felt something she hadn't in a long time. Hope. The foal stumbled slightly as it tried to keep up with Shadow, and Clara let out a soft giggle that made Rachel's heart swell. Shadow turned his head toward the sound, his ears flicking forward as if he understood Clara's amusement. He nickered softly, and Clara responded with a gentle wave of her hand. Rachel watched the exchange with a growing sense of awe. It was as if Shadow could see into Clara's soul, understanding her in ways that even Rachel couldn't. Later that night, when the stars shone bright and the world seemed to hold its breath, Shadow did something that took Rachel by surprise. He walked to the edge of the clearing, turned back to look at Clara, and let out a low, resonant whinny. Clara tilted her head, her expression one of curiosity and wonder. Rachel, unsure of what Shadow was trying to communicate, moved closer to her daughter. Shadow stood still for a moment, then turned and began walking toward the hills. The foal hesitated, looking back at Clara before following Shadow. Rachel felt a pang of sadness as she realized they were leaving. She placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, ready to comfort her, but Clara surprised her once again. Instead of showing sadness, Clara reached out toward the retreating figures and whispered, "Thank you." The words were soft, barely audible, but they carried a depth of emotion that left Rachel speechless. For Clara, the bond with Shadow and the foal had been a gift, a connection that had opened her world in ways Rachel could never have imagined. The next morning, Clara woke early and insisted on returning to the clearing. Rachel obliged, curious to see if Shadow might return. They waited for hours, but the Mustang and his herd were nowhere to be seen. Yet Clara didn't seem disappointed. She gazed out at the horizon with a calmness that Rachel had never seen in her before. It was as if she knew that Shadow and the foal were out there, thriving in the wild, and that was enough. As the days turned into weeks, Clara's transformation became more evident. She started speaking more, her words coming slowly but with purpose. Her therapist noticed the change immediately, marveling at how she seemed more engaged and willing to communicate. Rachel, too, felt the shift in their lives. The grief that had weighed so heavily on them began to lift, replaced by a newfound sense of possibility. Shadow and the foal didn't return, but their presence lingered in the hearts of Clara and Rachel. The Mustang had given them more than a moment of connection. He had shown them the strength of resilience, the beauty of trust, and the power of quiet understanding. For Clara, the encounter had been life-changing, a reminder that even in the face of loss, there was always hope to be found. The weeks that followed felt like a new chapter in Clara and Rachel's lives, one written with hope rather than grief. Each morning, Clara would sit by the camper window, her eyes scanning the horizon as if waiting for a familiar silhouette to reappear. Shadow and the foal hadn't returned, but Clara didn't seem sad. Instead, she carried their memory with a quiet strength that inspired Rachel. It was as though the connection with the wild Mustang had left behind an unspoken message. She was capable of so much more than anyone had believed. Clara's progress astounded everyone. Her therapist, who had long struggled to reach her, found her more open and willing to engage. She began speaking in short, clear sentences, expressing thoughts and emotions she had kept locked away for years. Rachel would often find her drawing pictures of Shadow and the foal, their forms captured in simple, heartfelt strokes. Each drawing was like a small piece of her journey, a testament to the bond that had changed everything. One sunny afternoon, Clara surprised Rachel by insisting they go back to the clearing. Rachel hesitated, unsure if it was a good idea, but Clara's determined gaze left no room for doubt. Together, they made the familiar trek across the plains, the warm breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers. When they reached the spot under the old oak tree, Clara closed her eyes and tilted her face toward the sun, a serene smile playing on her lips. Rachel watched her, heart swelling with pride and gratitude. They spent hours there, listening to the distant hum of nature and the rustling grass. Though Shadow didn't appear, the clearing felt alive with his presence. Clara seemed at peace, her quiet joy radiating in a way that made Rachel feel as though they were exactly where they needed to be. Rachel sat beside her daughter, resting her hand gently on Clara's. No words were spoken, but none were needed. Later that evening, back at the camper, Clara held one of her drawings up to Rachel. It was a picture of Shadow standing tall with the foal beside him, their figures surrounded by the rolling hills of Mustang Valley. Beneath the drawing, Clara had scrawled a single word in careful, uneven letters: free. Rachel felt tears sting her eyes as she took the paper from her daughter, her voice trembling as she said, "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Clara nodded, her smile soft but full of meaning. She didn't seem sad that Shadow was gone. Instead, she seemed to understand something Rachel had only begun to grasp. The Mustang's freedom wasn't just about running wild across the plains. It was about strength, resilience, and the courage to embrace life fully, no matter how difficult it might be. As night fell and the stars appeared, Rachel and Clara sat together under the vast expanse of the sky. The memory of Shadow and the foal lingered between them, a reminder of the beauty that could be found in unexpected moments. For the first time in a long while, Rachel felt at peace, knowing that they were moving forward, free, just like the Mustang.